Take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is a weekend edition, and we have our regular roundtable here. And first of all, I want to thank Penna Dexter for covering the show on Tuesday, Debbie Georgiadis for covering it Wednesday and Thursday. I was up at the Kanakut Institute teaching, a place that Kelly Shackelford knows only so well because he teaches there as well and has known the founder of that institute for many, many years. We're going to be talking about Chip and Joanna Gaines. They're in the news, and so we might as well talk about that. Whether this election recount is going to make any difference. What about some of the cabinet appointments by Donald Trump? And certainly we'll look at the whole issue of the filibuster and whether that's going to change the confirmation of some of those individuals and maybe even a Supreme Court nominee. Penna Dexter's commentary today on environmental reset. So as always, Penna, we have lots to talk about.
We do. I don't know if it's you that sent me this article about the real reason Hillary asked for a recount. It was actually people encouraged her to get her out of her post-election depression. And even and apparently, here's the quote: "She is weepy, looks 10 years older, and is very whiny."
Yes.
She mopes around all day, swimming in a sea of recriminations. So they said, go ahead and do this recount, get immersed in something. And even President Obama encouraged it because he thought it would be good for the Democrats.
Is the one that actually pursues that. And the Green Party has disassociated themselves with her, so I don't think anything's going to happen. But we certainly have a lot to talk about today, and it relates a lot to some of the things we talk about with you, Kelly, in terms of whether or not a Christian can express his or her religious convictions in the public arena. But in the case of Chip and Joanna Gaines, they have never expressed their opinion. I, a while back, happened to sit down and watch their entire I Am Second interview. I've read some of the things that were in People magazine. So you really had to work pretty hard to put them under the microscope, and it has to do with a BuzzFeed article that carried the headline, "Chip and Joanna Gaines' Church is firmly against same-sex marriage." Of course, you could also say Chip and Joanna Gaines goes to a church. Horrors. And more importantly, they believe in traditional marriage. But it gets back to some of these religious liberty issues, doesn't it?
Yeah, and one of the good things about this story, I think, is that, or one of the only good things, is that it I think, showed us something that we predicted right after the election. And that is that after the election, I think it was fairly clear that one of the bad things that was going on in the country was a blanket of political correctness, where it was, and political correctness is oppressive. It's anti-Christian. They don't want you to speak truth. It's anti all kinds of speech, but I mean, it's really evil. Donald Trump, for all of his faults and everything else, there's no doubt that he blew a hole in political correctness. And it wasn't just for him, though, and I don't think people realize this. I think people all across the country were kind of tired of this onerous blanket they were wearing, and I think part of the election was to reject it and to say, no more of this. So this is, I mean, we've had this happen, this type of thing happen with very little basis, and they thought, we're going to go after this couple, we're going to make an issue of the fact they go to a church where they believe that marriage is between a man and a woman, and we're going to create all kinds of trouble. And guess what happened? Everybody said, we've had enough of this, okay? This is over.
Yes.
And who is getting crushed? It's the person who wrote the article. And this is really, I don't know if people are noticing what's happening, but this is a part of a bigger thing that I think we're seeing. And I think it's going to cause more people to stand up. I think it's going to cause more people to speak up. I think it's going to give courage to people in the church to say, I'm not putting up with this anymore. And I think it's going to be a really good thing for the country because it's going to stop these kinds of attacks on good people like Chip and Joanna Gaines, who didn't deserve this, nor did their pastor. And I think people aren't going to put up with it anymore. I mean, some people still are slow to learn. They're still going to try this kind of stuff, but it's not going over like it used to. Just like it didn't go over with, the United Auto Workers in Michigan who voted for Trump. I think that whole thing is over, at least for a while, and I think this is a good sign that this kind of silliness and personal destruction and PC kind of attacks are really going to have a lot more trouble.
I might just mention, if you're not familiar with them, of course, they're on HDTV, and of course, they're very well known because it may be the most popular program called Fixer Upper on that network and in that genre of individuals. So certainly they've been very popular. They've been on the cover of People magazine. But if you're not familiar with them, we have two articles. One that talks about the gains of the latest target, which Kelly's talking about. But we also posted one that we passed around to each other. Individual homosexual going to have a same-sex marriage, but nevertheless said that this hit piece on the gains is dangerous and writes that in the Washington Post. So when you have a homosexual who has some kind of prominence writing in the Washington Post saying enough of this, that's pretty good news that maybe things are changing.
Again, I think it's a sign of something that's changed. And so I encourage people to keep their eyes open to this because I think there are things that you can say now that you could have said before but would have caused problems that now you're allowed to say. I mean, I do think that there's been a change in our culture.
I think you're probably right. When I first heard the news story, I had a sinking feeling
about
it. Yeah, because they weren't able to get, the left was able to get the Benham brothers, prevent them from having a show. But they weren't able to get the Duck Dynasty show off the air. And, success speaks very well, and the Gaines make a lot of money for HGTV. But, the idea is that they are not going to be content until everybody affirms same-sex marriage. And so what they do is they try to take the highest profile, most loved people and send a message. But I was really happy to see, for instance, the piece you just mentioned, Kerby, by Brandon Ambrosino, I think is how you pronounce his name. I've read his stuff before. He's gay. He's going to get married, but he's a thinking person. He says, this is just disingenuous to attack these people. And, it's still almost half the country opposes same-sex marriage. And this stuff has been forced on them. And I do think this election, it was sort of an election for the people. I mean, we Hicks who still believe in the Bible. It was an election for us. I mean, this candidate was not, a Bible-toting Christian, but the election was in part for us.
Let me go around the round table, too, about this issue, because Michael Brown, we didn't post his piece, but he also ties it to the broader issue. You mentioned Duck Dynasty, and of course, we mentioned the Benham brothers, and they both, of course, been on this program. But we can talk about Eric Walsh in his church, and that's certainly something that a number of individuals, including Kelly Shackelford, have talked about. Kelvin Cochran, who is the Atlanta fire chief. You have individuals that have been fired for various stands. In the broader context, Kelly, we are talking about maybe this is good news for some of those religious liberty cases that you've been dealing with over the last couple of years.
Yeah, I think so. I think we're seeing all kinds of just bizarre things right now. I don't know if you covered this when I wasn't here, but the idea, for instance, that this designer who did the dresses for the first ladies would not do one for Melania. And what's amazing is all of a sudden, boom, all these things are coming out going, oh, somehow that's okay, but it's not okay for the clients to not make a wedding cake. It's incredible to see what's happening and how the worm is turning, I guess you'd say.
Well, first, certainly. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation, Weekend Edition, right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, if you think about it, your life is the culmination of lots and lots of decisions. Jim Clifton, CEO of Gallup, argues that people make 10,000 to 20,000 small decisions every day. If you multiply this by the U.S. population, you end up with 1 quadrillion decisions. This is one of the points Jeff Myers makes in his book, Understanding the Culture. The legacy you leave is the sum of all your decisions. Many are inconsequential. Others determine the future direction of your life. Some don't seem that important at the time, but they turn out to be some of the most significant decisions you ever made. So how should we make decisions? First, we should consult the Bible. We know that God's will can be found in the Bible since it is full of specific commands and principles. Second, we should pray. We can discern God's will through prayer. Philippians 4:6 says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your request to God." Third, consult your conscience. If your conscience troubles you, then there is reason that you should stop and not proceed. Acts 24:16 says, Christians should strive to have a good conscience before God and man. By the way, a clear conscience isn't always a justification for proceeding. The Bible teaches the heart is deceitful above all things. We can easily deceive ourselves into sin. Finally, seek counsel. Proverbs 15:22 says, plans fail for lack of counsel, but with many advisors they succeed. Wisdom comes from many counselors. Share your decision with other godly men and women. Their collective response will often provide God's direction in a matter. As Christians, we should strive to make wise and godly decisions about our life. How we make decisions will affect the rest of our life and leave a legacy of faith for others to follow. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Power of Three and Smith Global Media present Believe. One boy's decision to believe could change everything. Believe. Rated PG. Now playing. Believe.film.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, as we are talking about a number of issues at the moment, talking just a little bit longer about Chip and Joanna Gaines. If you have not watched Fixer Upper on well, actually, I should say that it's on another channel, HGTV. A&E was the Duck Dynasty one. I was jumping ahead of that because that was something that happened with the Phil Robertson. And then, of course, we also mentioned the Benham brothers and that one as well. So there are all sorts of issues simultaneously. But, Penna, just a minute ago, we were talking about the designer that said, you know, I would love to make a gown and did make a gown for the First Lady, but not this First Lady, not Melania. What about that?
Yeah, her name is Sophie Thiollet, and she announced in November she would not be dressing Melania Trump because of, quote, the rhetoric of racism, sexism, and xenophobia unleashed by her husband's presidential campaign. These are incompatible, she said, with the shared values we live by. And, you know, it's so interesting. I don't think that Melania has asked her to design anything, and certainly won't. There are plenty, I'm sure there are plenty of designers that would be happy to do so.
For sure.
But I liked what Mary Catherine Ham of The Federalist said. She said, and her piece was titled, "Refusing to serve customers you don't agree with is suddenly cool again."
Kelly, you said people have been thinking this, but they have been afraid to say it in town now. Is that right?
It's amazing how the PC world is collapsing. And again, I don't know how long. I don't know if this is a permanent thing. It's a temporary thing, but I think I hope we take advantage of the opportunity to make it a permanent thing. Because I think it's one of the more subtle evils that I mean, if you think of a place like Nazi Germany, it wasn't that a majority of people in Nazi Germany supported Adolf Hitler. Mm-hmm. It was that most people were scared to say anything. And so that's the kind of culture that when it starts to get into place can lead to very bad things. And it was starting to lead to that in this country. And I think people realize that. It was part of the whole malaise that people felt about the country's going in the wrong direction. So I think this is part of the good part of common sense, moral, basic Americans saying, we've been a little too complacent about this, and we're not going to stand for this anymore. When we see this, we're going to speak it, we're going to call it out, and we're going to refuse to allow it to continue to occur. So I think it's great. So I love it when this, and what's funny is these people who still think they're in the, it reminds me of kind of post 9/11 and pre 9/11. Things kind of changed a little bit. These people are still pre-election. They still think it's in the PC world where they can come out and make an announcement that somebody that didn't ask for their dress, that they're not going to design for them, and that's going to be a good thing.
We're not going to ask you anyway.
Yeah, and it's turning out kind of bad. I mean, even I think it was Tommy Hilfiger that came out soon after that and said, I don't agree with all of these politics, but this is wrong to discriminate against people. And so I thought, fascinating. It
is fascinating.
It's interesting to watch.
Overplayed their hand, I think, is a better way to say that.
Well, this is
gone
big,
too far.
Yeah, it's a big overplay. And in a sense, even the Duck Dynasty people, they made some public statements about their positions on these issues. And this one was an overreach because all it is that the Gaines go to this church. They mentioned and they're open Christians, but they never took a position on same-sex marriage publicly. They never wrote anything about it. They never did anything on their show about it. There's no event that took place that would cause this. It's just because they go to that church. And I mean, it kind of reminds me of the Eric Walsh issue because he preached at a church. He had a leadership role, but this even takes it further.
Yes.
That they attend a church, which makes them unacceptable now to be hosts of this show on HGTV.
It's amazing. It's good. It's good to watch. It's good to see and to continue to watch these things. But I'm seeing a different response to these things. I'm seeing a different approach. I'm seeing a different lack of success. And so I think that's encouraging. And, and again, the Gaines haven't even said anything, done anything. They haven't had to because the whole country came out and said, absolutely not. This is ridiculous. And so I think that's a great thing if we can just see more of it.
We're waiting until Monday, but we'll probably have an action item on this just in case you wanted to let HGTV know or maybe the pastor know or something like that. So we've got some ideas, but we figured we'd wait and love to get your comments. 1-800-351-1212. Maybe you have some thoughts about Chip and Joanna Gaines, and I might even post their I Am Second video, which is very well done, by the way. And, of course, their book is out on the front page of magazine People and on and on and on. But let's get into a couple of other issues that I know some people have been wondering about. And Kelly and Penna, I don't know if you get this, but I get this every time I walk into a Sunday school class or in any kind of group of church people. They say, well, now they're doing recounts of some of these states. And is it possible that this would be overturned? And so one of the pieces that I put up here is that indeed the Trump victory margins are recount proof. And in case you wonder about that, yesterday in Wisconsin, they added up the votes so far, and it made a difference of precisely one vote.
Wow.
Not exactly going to overturn this.
It costs a lot to do the recounts.
Yes. Let's talk about that for just a minute, because a recount is certainly allowed, but at the same time, if you look at the map, and I'll hold this up, we may put this on our website too. Those of you watching online, you can see this map that shows by county, red and blue, and it is amazing the number of square miles, square miles that are red and the number of square miles that are blue, and it's disproportionate. But again, the idea is that since some of these votes were not what the Clinton campaign and even some of the pollsters would have predicted, there must be some evidence, although we have none of it, that this was hacked by the Russians. But what do we know, Penna?
Well, we know we haven't seen any evidence of this yet, and all the experts around the country have said that, and so I don't think these are going to make a difference at all. I think what they are, as we mentioned at the beginning of the program, are just sort of a therapy session for the Democrats so that they can have a purpose right now and keep their base a little bit engaged. It's interesting because a Clinton advisor said that Bill Clinton actually, and he's got some pretty good political instincts.
Yes, he does.
He thinks the recount is going to backfire as a strategy because there are probably no more than a handful of questionable ballots. And they could actually wind up adding to Trump's numbers and validate rather than invalidate the election.
This is so silly.
Yeah.
It's silly on a lot of levels. Somebody asked me about this, and I said the only way that anything could happen here is if there was massive, fraud and chicanery by the lawyers. The problem with that is the Trump side is going to have their lawyers too.
Yeah.
And when you have a lot of lawyers looking over things, it's really hard. Lawyers are always suspicious. They're always looking. They're looking for every angle, and that's not going to happen when you have a team of lawyers making sure it doesn't happen. So, let's look at Pennsylvania. That was the funniest to me. Number one, they were late asking for the recount. It's not allowed.
Yeah.
So they filed a lawsuit.
Yeah.
Okay? And if they were to succeed in changing the date that's in the law, which I think would be outrageous, it was such a close race. It was only 70,000 votes that separated them. 70,000.
That's a lot to find.
Yeah.
That's a lot of votes to find. There's going to have to be a lot of station wagons and with the extra votes in the back they forgot to count. It's just unbelievable. So I don't know. I know it's a fundraising ploy for Jill Stein, but I don't understand the rest because I think it's just going to add more embarrassment to Hillary Clinton. I think I saw a story that Bill Clinton, in fact, said that this is a bad idea. Mm-hmm. So it really is odd, to say the least.
Put one more on the table. We do know of the possibility of a faithless elector. We have one in the state of Texas now that said he can't, in good conscience, vote for Donald Trump. But many of us have some friends that have been electors in the past and go on December 19th to their state capital, whether it's Tallahassee, Florida, or Austin, Texas, or Albany, New York, or Sacramento, California. Any possibility any faithless electors out there might vote for Hillary Clinton instead of Donald Trump? Any thoughts?
Well, I guess you'd have to have, again, just like the recount, you'd have to have a lot of faithless electors around the country. So, let me ask you this, Kerby, because you're the constitutional expert. If there's one faithless elector, say in Texas, how do the laws work in Texas? Does that electoral vote go to someone else, or does all the electoral votes have to go to one candidate?
Well, in this case, he's stepping down, so I assume they'll have an alternate. But there have been some situations where one vote went for George Wallace back in 1968. You've had one really interesting one where they voted in reverse. I don't know if that was a protest. And then you had one elector just more recently in 2000 that did not vote at all in the D.C. because the D.C. said they should get congressional action, so you wouldn't have the total number. But as long as you have 270, it doesn't matter if a few people don't vote. What would happen if you had a lot of people that said, I just won't vote at all, and you didn't get the requisite 270, then that brings us back to what Kelly's told us about before, and that is we have a 12th Amendment that tells us you go to the House of Representatives, finish the rest of what happens.
Well, what happens is you hold up this map and you go, uh-oh, not going to work out too well for Hillary Clinton there because it goes by state. Every state gets one vote.
Right.
And when you do that, guess what happens? All the flyover country ends up on the Republican side.
Very good. We've covered a lot, but if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll talk about some of those cabinet appointments right after this.
Power of Three, in association with Smith Global Media, presents Believe. Christmas is a time to be thankful. But when tough times hit the small town of Grundy, Virginia, everything seems lost. This December,
all things are possible to those who believe.
One boy's decision to believe could change everything. Believe. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested. Now play. More information is available at www.believe.film.
There is a spiritual battle underway for our minds and the minds of our neighbors. Romans 12:2 tells us not to be conformed to the culture, but to be transformed by the renewal of our minds. What can you do? Get a free copy of Kerby Anderson's new ebook, Spiritual Warfare, The Battle to Restore Christ in Our Culture. It is a spiritual battle, and it must be fought with spiritual weapons. Get your copy at pointofview.net. Look for Spiritual Warfare, The Battle to Restore Christ in Our Culture by Kerby Anderson. It's free, but only when you visit pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Weekend edition, and we have a round table, Penna, Dexter, and Kelly Shackelford, and we've already talked about Chip and Joanna Gaines, as well as the election recount. We're going to get into the issue of the cabinet, the filibuster, and some of these judicial appointments. But let me at least take one phone call before we get into some of that. So we'll head up to Maine, WSEW. Mike, thank you for calling today.
Hi, Kerby. Everybody, thanks for taking my call. And I love the Gaines program. I watch it when I go to visit my mom. And, I don't, I think it's cool. They don't use it as a platform to talk about their opinions. do their things, fixing up homes. They have their kids involved, and I think it's just a great show. And I love the fact that American people have responded the way they did. And I think that seeing the response to this and other things, and even the election, I think we're on the cusp of maybe a big spiritual awakening in our nation.
Well, certainly appreciate that comment. And if some of you would like to join our conversation, we'll continue taking phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. We have Penna, Dexter, Kelly, Shackelford here. Let's talk about these appointments. First of all, I guess first things first. The problem with some of these appointments to the Supreme Court or to the courts or even the FCC and all sorts of things is what was called the filibuster. Now, it used to be that you needed 2/3 of the United States senators to invoke cloture to prevent that. Then they changed the rules to 3/5, so it's 60. Well, you don't have 60 Republicans, but now they're talking about the fact that except for Supreme Court appointments, in many cases, you can actually push it through with a majority, which as we talked about with Mark Davis just 2 weeks ago, is a good idea. But I thought it was interesting, Kelly, you passed this on to me from Senator Chris Coons. He's from Delaware. They asked him, do you regret that Harry Reid and the Senate Democrats teamed up 3 years ago to nuke the filibuster? And I think his answer was, yes, because now the Republicans can do the very same thing.
Yeah, kind of one of those things you learned as a little child. If you can do it to them, they can do it to you. So not a real bright move by the Democrats to get rid of the filibuster, essentially, for everything except Supreme Court. Because now that means the Republicans can do the same thing. Now, the question is whether the Republicans are going to be, what is the word for this? I mean, stupid is too kind a word.
Too conciliatory?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, I don't know, people that just run around shooting themselves in the foot over and over again, look, when they create the rules, I mean, you don't unilaterally disarm and say, okay, well, every time you break the rules, we're going to let you, but we're never going to break the rules. And it's not breaking the rules; they're creating the rules. They can pass with the rules that they want.
This is not constitutional. That's why I said it used to be 2/3. Now it's 3/5, and so this has nothing to do with the Constitution. And back to another point, we're going to talk about Supreme Court in just a minute, but aren't there over 100 various federal judge appointments that need to take place almost immediately? Because in the last year, oftentimes, nobody does anything because they're all running for re-election or election. So you've got a federal judiciary that's sort of almost skeleton crew right now, isn't it?
Yeah, people are focused on the Supreme Court for good reason. It's a very important seat, Justice Scalia's seat, but there are about 100 federal judicial seats open right now, not just the district court. We're talking about the federal court of appeals, very high levels, and Donald Trump has got to fill those.
Yes.
And that's in addition to all these cabinets and the 4,400 seats we're talking about. I mean, that's a lot. So there's a lot of work to be done and a lot of change that's going to happen just by the people that are appointed to these positions.
Well, all I have to say is I hope that the Republicans hold on to the rule that Harry Reid created to benefit the Democrats long enough to benefit from it. Because as we said, and it's not childish play, it's playing fair. They got to pack the bench. President Obama, before last year, did fill the bench with a lot of his nominees, and so it has to be rebalanced now. And since they did that, since they changed it from 2/3 or whatever it was down to 51 votes, we should take the Republicans should, only fairly, in order to do their job, they really should take care of that, take advantage of that.
Now, here's the big question: is are the Republicans going to, get rid of the filibuster on the Supreme Court nominee?
Yeah, that's a big question.
And because the Democrats didn't do that, not that they wouldn't if they needed to, they just didn't need to, and so they didn't do that. But once you sort of throw out the rules on everything that's advantageous to you, the normal thing would be for somebody to say, hey, look, we're not going to let this bother us. We're going to do the rules so that we can pass our people through, too. I think what's going to really happen, though, I've already seen an article where 5 or 6 Republican senators said they're not in favor of getting rid of the filibuster
for the Supreme Court.
For the Supreme Court. But I think if President Trump, if as president he nominates someone to the Supreme Court who is not some weird crazed out of the mainstream, which there's really not people, there's nobody like that on the list. And so I'm sure everybody they're going to try to say they are.
Yeah.
But if they're not, and they're really the kind of people on his list, fellow judges are already out there, people like Senator Mike Lee, whatever. If the Democrats were to try to stall that for a long period of time, I have no doubt that they would get such pressure from the country that they would bust the filibuster. So, but I think the Democrats know that. So I think they might try to cause trouble for a little while. But I have people predicting to me that they will filibuster for a year on the first Supreme Court nominee. And that'd be
Chuck Schumer, right? Because he'd be leading that, right?
And I just don't see that. I really don't see that, because I think that would mean that the Republicans would say no more filibuster.
Can you imagine the tweets that Donald Trump would put out, if nothing else, in that regard?
And look,
goodness,
this is how the election was decided.
Yes.
I was talking to somebody this morning, and they were talking about Scalia's death, and I said to them, that resulted in Donald Trump's election. And they looked at me and they went, "Oh my gosh, you're right." Because if he hadn't died, there wouldn't have been a focus on the Supreme Court. And that was the number one issue of the, evangelicals, which was the huge turnout, which was 81% of them voted for Trump. And their number one issue, wasn't even close, was the courts.
Right.
And they were similar, very high for other constituency groups. But that issue is the issue. So if you filibuster that issue and you try to kill the ability of the president to follow through on I just don't see that as being a smart political move, but I'm sure they'll start off trying to see if they can get traction, but I think that will not work long term.
And I might add, too, when we talk about filibuster, we're not just talking about Supreme Court nominees or federal court nominees. We're talking about the cabinet, and there have been some possibility of trying to filibuster Jeff Sessions as Attorney General, or James Mad Dog Mattis, who hasn't been announced till Monday, but is going to be the Secretary of Defense, it looks like. So these are all really important issues, and if you change the rules on the filibuster, which, again, Harry Reid did,
yes,
you can't have Chuck Schumer now piously standing in the Senate saying, no, we can't have these kind of rules, when he was the one that voted for the rules that allowed the Democrats to do it in the first place.
Yep.
He still may do that, but he can't do it with any kind of credibility.
No. I think that's huge. It's going to make a big difference as these nominees are coming through.
Can you imagine the fights we'd be having right now over the cabinet if we had to wait for the filibuster and to deal with that? So it is kind of interesting what was done, and to try to really rig the system in a sense is now benefiting the Trump administration. And we were talking in the break about how it almost feels like he's president already because of how much he's doing. Yeah. He's really, I've read pieces about how quickly he has already named his cabinet, much quicker than most other presidents. He's really gotten to work.
You wouldn't know that if you read the New York Times, but they were saying he actually, apart from George Herbert Walker Bush, announced them earlier than any other cabinet.
Which is a little different, because he was almost an extension of the Reagan administration.
So that just shows you how much more on the ball he's been than even some of his predecessors.
I certainly did not predict everything in this election, as most of us didn't. But I do want to remind something I said months ago, when everybody was concerned about Trump. And I said, well, the one thing that people really have to watch for is he might, because what he does, he goes to who's the expert in this.
Yes.
And so who's the expert on economics? Oh, look, there's Steve Moore, leading conservative on economics. And who's this? Oh, there's a leading conservative on this. I said, might be shocking to people when I say this, but I said he might end up with the most conservative cabinet and appointments of any president we've seen.
Yeah.
And
Tom
you know
Price,
what?
Jeff Sessions, Betsy DeVos, I'd say yes.
That's now happening.
People we know, people we talk to. Yeah.
And so that's sort of the downside with Trump. Well, he doesn't know all these things. He's new to this. But that's exactly what leads to him going to get the experts on this from his side, which is the conservative side, and he's finding all these conservative stalwarts that he's putting in these positions. So he might end up with the most conservative cabinet of people, more than Reagan, we'll have to wait and see. But that's kind of shocking to most people, but I think they're watching it happen somewhat.
Yeah, well, Kelly said it. I told you so, and he got a chance to say, I told you so.
Dan Henninger at Wall Street Journal said Trump has a first-rate somebody at the Trump team has a first-rate Rolodex. They do.
We'll be right back.
On November 7th, a United Nations Conference on Climate Change convened in Marrakesh, Morocco. It's been the plan for years that this meeting would take place just 3 days after the Paris Climate Treaty went into force, thus hastening its implementation. 97 countries, accounting for approximately 2/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions, have now ratified the treaty. The U.S. is not one of them. The treaty would require that the U.S. reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. During the campaign, Donald Trump said he'd pull the U.S. out of the Paris Accords and stop funding the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and its Green Climate Fund. Now he says he'll, quote, keep an open mind about it. He should stick with his original promise, because the Paris Treaty will do little, if anything, to rein in global warming, at great cost to the economy. Environmental policy expert Bjorn Lomborg calculates that these cuts, if implemented between 2016 and 2030, would reduce temperature rises by a minuscule 0.09 degrees Fahrenheit. Dr. Lomborg estimates the hit to U.S. gross domestic product at approximately $150 billion per year. Bloomberg calculates it at more like $500 billion a year. Mr. Trump also said he'd, and again I'm quoting him, cancel job-killing restrictions on the production of American energy. He's referring to the capabilities for fracking and the development of new drilling techniques that give us the ability to tap new reserves of oil and gas. The White House and the EPA have responded with crushing regulations on this technology, which could otherwise essentially render the U.S. energy independent. There's a positive sign. Mr. Trump's choice of Myron E. Bell to head up the part of his transition team dealing with the EPA. At the Competitive Enterprise Institute, Mr. E. Bell has been developing common sense policy that protects the environment, yet minimizes industry and economy-destroying environmental regulation. It's possible Myron E. Bell himself may be the one the president chooses to head up the EPA. This has climate activists beside themselves. Last week, they waited until darkness fell in Washington, D.C. and beamed huge images onto EPA headquarters, demanding that the Trump administration pick someone else. Students at Harvard and Georgetown have been demonstrating against his appointment. The Wall Street Journal's Kim Strassel pointed out in a column that the real battle will be over how to dismantle the repressive environmental regime the administration has constructed. She writes, quote, "This is where the president's broad-based rules have arguably done the most damage to the economy. It is also where the progressive left is most organized and most emotional. Some of our most expensive regulations can be undone fairly easily, since Congress never passed them. But for the needed reset on the environment, Congress and the new administration have work to do." For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. It is our weekend edition roundtable with Penna Dexter, Kelly Shackelford, and I'd love to get some of your comments. We've already talked about Chip and Joanna Gaines. We'll get some more of those calls in just a minute. We talked a little bit about the election recount, and now we're talking about the cabinet and the filibuster. But those of you that listen online, you probably have already heard this piece by Penna Dexter, the environmental reset, and that's someone else, because another individual that we've interviewed here before, Myron Ebel, I think is how you pronounce his name, is being put forward as an individual with the Environmental Protection Agency. And in light of some of the audio that we played a while back from Kathy Adams and some others who were at this Marrakesh, Morocco United Nations Conference on Climate Change, I get the sense the environmentalists are just not too thrilled about this possible pick by Donald Trump. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I thought it was funny that it was the environmental conference began the day after the election.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so the election, I'm certain, changed the tenor of the conference. And, you know, the U.S. is going to be moving at the UN in different ways now, I think. But the other part of this was just 3 days after that beginning of that conference was the Paris Climate Treaty was supposed to take effect. Now, we haven't ratified it by our Senate, but our president has ceded to it. And that causes us to have to drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so it's so interesting that right during that time, the person who heads up the transition team on the EPA area is Myron. You're saying Ebel. I was pronouncing it Ebel, but
yeah, it probably is.
He is. We've had him on the show. I've interviewed him. You've interviewed him.
But I always forget how to pronounce his
name. And he's with Competitive Enterprise Institute. He's a really smart guy and very reasonable, and he has the science. And, global warming has not turned out to be harming the environment the way all these people say. But there's so many companies and businesses that now are in this alternative energy business that, have depended on the Obama administration's policies. And so they're very threatened by this. The left is very threatened by this because they love the global warming issue. It allows them to control the economy. So all that is slipping away from them, and they're very upset. So Marvin Ebel is the head of the transition team for that. He also could be the actual EPA head. His name is up there for that. Mm-hmm. And they're very upset about that. So they're trying to basically bork him. And the Heritage Foundation today, the Daily Signal, came out with a piece. Climate data deniers are trying to bork Trump's EPA transition leader. And what's at stake, they say, is Big Green is billions upon billions of dollars taken from taxpayers and consumers and given to green crony businesses. And
like Solyndra?
Like Solyndra, exactly. So there's that. But there's also just the control factor. The environment has always been a way to control economies and at the global level. And so, this is a disruptive administration coming in to actually kind of change all that. Now, they have some hope in the daughter of the president because she is still very much of the left on the environment and on those issues. And so they're hoping that she will have her father's ear and that he won't so drastically change things and move back towards fossil fuels. So we'll see how that all works out. You never know. But at this point, it looks good. So it's going to be interesting to see some of these economic appointments. We've already seen some this week with Treasury and Commerce. But when we start seeing the EPA and other things, I think it'll make a big impact on the economy.
I might just mention your commentary is available at pointofview.net. And in there you have a quote from Bjorn Lomborg. Mm-hmm. He is an individual, used to be with Greenpeace, and has written a book called The Skeptical Environmentalist. I've got it just down the hallway here. It's about 300 pages, and there's a lot in there. But he did a calculation, and you have this in your commentary about the fact that if you even say, okay, we do have a problem with global warming, and we don't seem to be, but okay.
He thinks it's more real than maybe we think it is.
Yeah, and he recognizes some of this has to do not with man-made, but it has to do with solar cycles and a variety of other things. But okay, if indeed you're convinced that we can do something to mediate that, whether it's due to all environmental factors, all human factors, or a mixture of the two, he runs the numbers. And in your commentary here, you talk about even if we implemented all the cuts that come from the Paris Climate Treaty from now to 2030, you would actually reduce the temperature by 9/100ths of a degree Fahrenheit. That's after all the draconian.
And how much does it cost?
And it costs a lot of money.
$150 billion a year. Each year. That's with a B, which is a lot more than most of us around the table have, right? I mean, so you sped. There's never been a bigger issue in which you have a tremendous amount of bang and buck. In this case, you have lots of bucks and no bang. Yet, on the other hand, if you try to just provide fresh water for people in Africa, that has just a very small buck and a tremendous bang. Yeah. So of all the criteria that he looked at, the one that's at the absolute bottom of the list are things like the Paris Climate Accord.
It's so interesting, too, Kerby and Kelly, and that is when you do surveys of the top issues of the American people, global warming is not a big concern of American citizens. It's a concern of the left, number one, and some of these executives of these big companies that would benefit.
Well, again, if you're looking for bang for the buck, climate change regulations are not one of those. So that's EPA. But let's come back to, Kelly, something we talked about here. This is a very interesting article that David French has put out, Stop Smearing Jeff Sessions. Well, he could be our next attorney general, and I'm hearing from you, and when we had Chelsea here a couple of weeks ago, that you think this attorney general would be very good for a lot of your religious liberty cases. Why so?
Well, he's got a long history of being a real champion, and I mean, this is a guy from the state of Alabama who's been very conservative, very consistent. One of the things I hate to see, because on a lot of levels, he's a senator. Okay, he and Chuck Schumer were friendly, got along well. All of a sudden, when he's nominated for Attorney General, he becomes like some racist, ghoulish figure, that you've never seen before. This is the kind of thing that makes people look at politicians and go, "You guys are just all fake." The attack on him is, what is it? Is it something he's done? It's something he allegedly said over 30 years ago that he said he never said in the first place. And it's like, can't you look at the guy's life for the last 30 years and see how he's acted and how he's treated? And all of a sudden, he's a racist. Well, didn't he prosecute the KKK? Didn't he go after these people? Yeah. It just shows you it doesn't seem to matter what people do if you can try to, hang a boogeyman thing around their neck. People will try to do it. And I hope the political correctness stuff spills over into the politics, the anti-political correctness, where this kind of stuff stops. Let's talk about legitimate issues. You can have legitimate issues and say, I don't think this person would make a good attorney general because I don't think they would do this. Or I don't think that, and here's the evidence I have because here's what they've done in their life. Here's where their stances are. But the idea is when you've been a person who took aggressive action to prosecute white supremacists, and when you have been for the last 30 years what Jeff Sessions has been, to try to dredge something up that was probably a falsity from over 30 years ago to destroy a man, that's the kind of stuff that I think makes people ill about politics and what they try to do to people.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about some of the other cabinet appointees and maybe a little more on Jeff Sessions, because I think you need to know a little bit more. But as you go to the website, you'll see Penna Dexter's commentary on environmental reset. And if you have not signed up for those, I would encourage you to do that. And of course, as we have been mentioning, even this week when we had our Tuesday Giving Day, we certainly encourage you to support this ministry. So click on that button that says Donate Now, and if you can help us out financially, we would greatly appreciate it. When we come back, we have all sorts of other cabinet appointees to talk about and a lot more to cover up. So we'll see if we can cover that, discuss it, and give you a chance to join the conversation. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
Power of Three, in association with Smith Global Media, presents Believe. Christmas is a time to be thankful. But when tough times hit the small town of Grundy, Virginia, everything seems lost. This December,
all things are possible to those who believe.
One boy's decision to believe could change everything. Believe. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested. Now play. More information is available at www.believe.film.
There is a spiritual battle underway for our minds and the minds of our neighbors. Romans 12:2 tells us not to be conformed to the culture, but to be transformed by the renewal of our minds. What can you do? Get a free copy of Kerby Anderson's new ebook, Spiritual Warfare, The Battle to Restore Christ in Our Culture. It is a spiritual battle, and it must be fought with spiritual weapons. Get your copy at pointofview.net. Look for Spiritual Warfare, The Battle to Restore Christ in Our Culture by Kerby Anderson. It's free, but only when you visit pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, it is our weekend edition. Penna, Dexter, and Kelly Shackelford. First hour, we spent some time talking about Chip and Joanna Gaines, and if you'd like to join us, certainly that is an issue that we will still keep on the table. What about the diversity police and this witch hunt and some of the reaction that has come to it? Talked about the election recount. At the moment, focusing a lot of our time and attention first on the filibuster and now on the cabinet, and there are all sorts of issues to put on the table, but I'd love to get your thoughts. What are your thoughts about some of the individuals that Donald Trump has put forward as his cabinet nominees? What about some of the reaction to Chip and Joanna Gaines? We'll get into some other issues in just a minute. But I thought it would be good to go around the round table again and talk about Jeff Sessions for just a minute. The Attorney General is so important. And one of the things that David French said, Penna, was stop smearing Jeff Sessions. And I love what Kelly said just a minute ago, in case people weren't here. These are colleagues in the Senate. They treat each other with tremendous respect. If you ever watch that, they'll say, my esteemed senator from Alabama, my esteemed senator from Utah, or whatever it might be. But the moment they're put forward, you would think that Jeff Sessions was just the most mean-spirited individual that wants to put people back in chains, is the head of the Ku Klux Klan, and is wanting to deny voting rights for every individual. And there's not a shred of evidence for that, but for people that are kind of low-information voters that go, maybe Donald Trump picked some kind of radical redneck to actually sit on the chair of the Attorney General.
He's a Southern gentleman, and I've met him, and he took a stroll. Well, first of all, he jumped into the Trump campaign very early because he does have a big concern about national security, about our border. And so he's been very strong on those issues. And when you are strong on the border and wanting to get our immigration system abiding by the rule of law, you do get called a racist. He's a rule of law guy. That's what he is. And that's why he's being attacked.
You know, Kelly, let me talk about this, because if there's one thing that Kelly Shackelford said over the last 2 years, it's been that there has been a politicized Justice Department. Would Jeff Sessions return it back to the way it used to be?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things. There's zero doubt as to whether Jeff Sessions would allow the Justice Department to be politicized. The answer is no. And by that, I mean, people don't understand what I mean. There are always people at the very top who are political appointees, and there are certain policies that they are more in favor of, et cetera. That's different from all the way up and down the line, people being told not to defend federal laws. This is the stuff that's been going on under Obama that hasn't gone on under any president. I mean, President Clinton, whatever. And it's so important because when the president comes in, they're always operating under laws that were passed under other presidents, not them. And so if they can say, well, we're just not going to follow this one and we're not going to defend this one, then we've lost the rule of law. And that has been, I mean, we've really come close. And I mean, the FBI investigation, the Justice Department, I mean, the Attorney General meeting with Bill Clinton right before the investigation. I mean, the stuff that we were watching was just, I mean, it's like we were watching our system of justice being lit on fire. I mean, it just was incredibly destructive. There is no way that Jeff Sessions will do any such thing. If Jeff Sessions was told by President Trump to violate the law, Jeff Sessions would say, that's not going to happen. So, I mean, this is the kind of person we want as the Attorney General. Somebody who's honorable, somebody who's honest, somebody who has integrity and is going to follow the rule of law, whether they like it or not. no matter what their politics are, and so it's a really good pick. And I think you're going to see a little bit of theatrics because anytime you bring anything up about racism, even if there's no basis to it, it creates theatrics. But I think it's going to immediately, flame out because it's baseless, and then I think they're going to have nothing left, and he's going to fly right through. What they need to do on the Democrat side is they actually need to take a scalp. They need to stop somebody, because if they do, then they kind of stop everybody. Whenever they get to the first one, they kind of. But if I don't see anybody yet, or nothing's come out yet on anybody who's being nominated that we know of where there's anything they really have. So this is going to be fascinating to watch, because their whole goal is going to be slow it down, bog it down. Let's see what we can get on somebody, and Donald Trump's people are going to be flying right through until they get somebody, and that's what they're hoping to do. I don't think it will be Sessions, their colleague in the Senate, who's they've known for 30 years. I think even with the attacks, I think there's going to be a lack of sincerity behind what's going on that is really not going to allow that to go too far.
It's interesting that Harry Reid actually removed the tools that they would have had to do exactly what you just described.
Very interesting.
Yep.
The other question that people might have for you, Kelly, is you've had a chance to kind of look at some of these nominees that are actually going to maybe go through, and these would be federal court nominees, maybe even a Supreme Court nominee. How can we be sure that these individuals are going to be ones that we agree with? Because some with a long memory might say, I remember when George Herbert Walker Bush put forward David Souter, and that didn't turn out so well. And even a couple of times people have even brought up on this program George W. Bush and some of the others that have been either in the federal court or in the Supreme Court. So is there a process going on right now behind the scenes that we don't know about in which people are being evaluated?
Look, I think that Donald Trump wants to appoint a good, strong, conservative, and as he said, pro-life justice to the Supreme Court. I really think that's what he wants to do. Unfortunately, in my view, because we have now begun to read through the opinions of these judges, the list he was given is not a perfect list. There are people out there who we know would be very much like Scalia. And by that, I don't just mean their philosophy is right, but they're people who will not flinch. Mike Lee, who's on the list, is an example of that, right? I mean, I don't think most people who know Mike Lee, or Ted Cruz, for instance, he's not on the list, but there are people like that you look at and you go, he's not backing down off what the Constitution says. You're never going to get him in the Tea Party. I mean, I don't mean Tea Party like, I mean the snooty circles in D.C.
Right.
That pressure is not going to change. Yeah, cocktail parties. That's not going to change their opinion. Now, most people, unfortunately, it does, unbelievably. So if you want a Scalia, you got to have somebody that almost either, I don't want to say likes, but could care less what you think.
Yeah.
Because they're going to do what's right.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of people like that on the list.
Yeah, Jesse Helms and Antonin Scalia and some of them.
So I think he was hamstrung. I think President-elect Trump has got he's made a promise to go with this list, and so we're one of the few that have vetted the list. To be honest with you, that have gone through the opinions, that are reading the opinions, that are finding things that people don't know about. And we're trying to get that information to the right people.
Very good.
So that they have the information. But I just think people need to know, point of view listeners need to know, this is not like an easy, perfect list. You need to be in prayer.
Yeah.
You need to be speaking out. Your senators are going to be voting on this. And this is really important. I mean, this is the next justice. This is Scalia's replacement. And if you mess this up, then this is really a mess up, a big mess up. And I didn't want people to think it's just easy. You just close your eyes and pull somebody off the list, because it's not that way.
As you're saying, the election was not the end. It's really the beginning. So we'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, if you think about it, your life is the culmination of lots and lots of decisions. Jim Clifton, CEO of Gallup, argues that people make 10,000 to 20,000 small decisions every day. If you multiply this by the U.S. population, you end up with 1 quadrillion decisions. This is one of the points Jeff Myers makes in his book, Understanding the Culture. The legacy you leave is the sum of all your decisions. Many are inconsequential. Others determine the future direction of your life. Some don't seem that important at the time, but they turn out to be some of the most significant decisions you ever made. So how should we make decisions? First, we should consult the Bible. We know that God's will can be found in the Bible since it is full of specific commands and principles. Second, we should pray. We can discern God's will through prayer. Philippians 4:6 says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God." Third, consult your conscience. If your conscience troubles you, then there is reason that you should stop and not proceed. Acts 24:16 says, Christians should strive to have a good conscience before God and man. By the way, a clear conscience isn't always a justification for proceeding. The Bible teaches the heart is deceitful above all things. We can easily deceive ourselves into sin. Finally, seek counsel. Proverbs 15:22 says, plans fail for lack of counsel, but with many advisors they succeed. Wisdom comes from many counselors. Share your decision with other godly men and women. Their collective response will often provide God's direction in a matter. As Christians, we should strive to make wise and godly decisions about our life. How we make decisions will affect the rest of our life and leave a legacy of faith for others to follow. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Power of Three and Smith Global Media present Believe. One boy's decision to believe could change everything. Believe, rated PG, now playing Believe.film.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
1-800-351-1212. It is Weekend Edition. Penna, Dexter, Kelly, Shackelford. Let's go to Arkansas first. KCMH. David, I think you want to talk about some of these environmental issues that Penna Dexter has addressed today in her commentary. Go for it.
That's correct. In 1998, I had the opportunity to speak to a scientist who had been hired by the United Nations to study global warming. And he said that they had hired 10,000 scientists to do this over a period of several years. And they had assigned 100 of the scientists the task of supervising 8,990 of them. They gave 10 of them the assignment to supervise the 100, and he was one of the 10 that I spoke to, which means he was privy to all the information, not just some of it. And when they were done, after several years, not one scientist found anything to prove global warming. They submitted a report to that effect. The United Nations completely rewrote it to make it say the opposite and left their names on it, and he was outraged at the way they'd been used. And he kept talking about how there was a religious fanaticism behind the way they acted, and I asked him if it had anything to do with the fact that in 1953, Alice Bailey founded the Lucifer Publishing Company at 665 United Nations Plaza, and he said that he thought that it did.
But again, back to this issue of evidence, Penna, what have you found? Because again, some of these people that have done the research, whether it's Bjorn Lomborg or whether it's Robert Spencer's been on this program or a variety of other individuals, they're all saying pretty much the same thing, aren't they?
Well, the hysteria is based not on the actual data of what's happened over history. It's based on models and, trends that they've projected. And, even going back and digging down deep under those models, sort of gives us a different result than what is out there in the public. And so it's just another one of those demagogued issues. I mean, Al Gore demagogued it in his movie that he made and everything that he did. And he's made so much money from companies that have now provided alternative energy and,
carbon credits. And
all of that. So there is money to be made. Do they believe in it? Yes, a lot of people do. As a matter of fact, the caller mentioned the religious aspect of it. To some people, the earth is a religion.
Yes.
They don't worship God and Jesus Christ. They worship the earth. I mean, the founder of this radio ministry wrote a book called The Seal of Gaia. It was more of a novel, but we've understood for years that there is a religious aspect to this, sort of a paganistic aspect. But I think really the real issue here is the money that certain companies and interests can make when they take away the kind of fuel that makes the most sense for the economy.
So again, if you'd like to read Penna's commentary, it's on our website right now, and I really encourage you to sign up for it because you'll receive it in the email on Saturday. Mine go Monday through Friday. Hers comes out on Saturday. And we have some comments about Supreme Court justices. And, of course, Kelly Shackelford is here. So let's head to Alabama. Listen on the Internet. Ken, thank you for calling today.
Good afternoon. Real quick, talking about global warming, I believe it was Dr. Chuck Missler who said, and I'm paraphrasing, he said, the only thing, keeping you from knowing the truth is your conviction that you already have it. So,
That's a good Chuck Missler. He had a lot of those lines, didn't he?
Yeah, he's got a lot of those.
Certainly did.
Don't know if you saw the front page of the USA Today yesterday, but they had pictures of all the supposed candidates for the Supreme Court. And unfortunately, that guy, Mr. Pryor, Mr. William Pryor, is still on there.
Yes.
And I think I've talked to you about that before. He is the guy who personally confronted Judge Roy Moore and got him thrown off of the Alabama Supreme Court because he would not, quote, honor God, unquote. I was wondering, is there any way we can get that guy off that list?
Well, you can't move, the list is the list, right? This is the list he pledged to take off from. That doesn't mean that President-elect Trump chooses him off the list. And so that's why people who know things about the different judges can speak into that. They can speak into, for instance, you're from Alabama. You're talking about a guy from Alabama.
Correct.
And the Attorney General is going to be from Alabama.
I hope the Sessions will get a bug in Mr. Trump's ear about that.
Well, I think it's likely that most people are assuming the opposite. They're assuming that Sessions is friends with Bill Pryor, thinks very highly of Bill Pryor, and will probably push for Bill Pryor. Now, I don't know that's true. I'm just saying that's the kind of rumor. And so those type of things, that he was the guy who prosecuted Judge Roy Moore, are things that definitely people in the grassroots are talking about. There's also some particular opinions that he's written that people are very concerned about too.
Oh, really?
Can you talk about that? Some of those opinions?
Yeah, but it's hard because I want people to understand the other side. Most people know Bill Pryor as an incredibly brave, conservative, judge. When he went through his confirmation hearing, he was asked about Roe v. Wade, and he answered truthfully. Mm-hmm. Nobody does that. He basically said it's garbage. And he almost did not get confirmed. It was a brutal fight, which doesn't usually happen over, this level of a judicial appointment. And so a lot of people really respected him for that. And so a lot of people, they see that and they maybe didn't know about the Judge Roy Moore, prosecution, or they didn't know about a few of these decisions. Like one of the decisions is a decision that he didn't write, but there were three judges and he joined, which means he fully backed it. It's a decision called Glenn versus Brumby, where the court in that case ruled that transgenderism is protected under the Equal Protection Clause as sex discrimination. It's the most expansive, radical transgenderism decision in the country. And what issue is on its way up to the Supreme Court right now? And what issue is it like 4-4? It's this very issue. Most people have no idea, and in fact, most people who know him are shocked that he was a part of this decision. I don't know what his explanation would be publicly. I know that, a lot of lawyers have read this and go, well, there's really not an explanation that works, outside of oops, or something. But those, you have to realize with these 21 judges on this list, they have, not all of them, but certainly the ones that are judges for a number of years. There are hundreds and hundreds of opinions. And to be honest with you, almost no one's read through these. And we have read through most of these, and we're trying to provide the information of what's there. And so those kind of things, it's an interesting call because in your case, it's sort of like, what can we do? What can we do? Trump's making this decision fairly soon. Whether that's, tomorrow or that's, a month from now. It seems to be more like tomorrow. We'll see.
Yeah.
But you know what? Speaking into sessions, since you're concerned about an Alabama judge and you've got an Alabama guy going to be the attorney general, and certainly those are things you can speak into. And that's the great thing about the political process. The senators will have to vote on this. They have input. Everybody who's listening to this around the country can actually have a voice on this. You could even have a voice, I guess, by going on Trump's Twitter account and saying, hey, you made a promise. Now don't mess this up. Make sure you're real careful here and getting a really good, or whatever your opinion is, right? So I think everybody has an opportunity to speak into this. And I think for our audience, this is probably one of the most important issues they can be praying about, speaking into, that will ever come up, because this appointment is for life.
Right. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I would also encourage people, Penna, to pray for Kelly and his staff, because he just dug something out that a lot of people on the listening audience, I would imagine almost virtually everybody in the listening audience did not know about. So there's a kind of work that needs to happen behind the scenes. And you're doing it with people that were hired to do something else, right? Isn't that kind of what
that's our big problem. We were sitting around after the election and felt like, oh my gosh, we see now about 100 different opportunities to advance religious freedom. There's things like the Supreme Court justices that'll be appointed. There are 100 federal judicial seats, and these people are for life, right? So you affect one, you're affecting the next 40 to 50 years possibly of, on your issues with that judge. But then in addition to that, there's executive orders that can be rescinded, executive orders on religious freedoms that can be passed, executive actions that can be done. What if a President Trump said, okay, all these lawsuits by the HHS, I'm in charge of the HHS. All these lawsuits against ministries and against Hobby Lobby and the Little Sisters of the Poor and all that, those suits are all done. All the ones that are going, they're over because I'm the executive in charge now. So just think about those kind of things. And then legislation that can be passed. There's all this stuff. And we looked around and went, but we don't have any extra staff. So
people are burning the midnight oil.
We're doing that, and we had an emergency board meeting and said we've got to get new funds and new staff. And so we don't know, but we know we only have for sure 2 years before the window could close on these things with a new election. And so we're raising $4.5 million if the Lord desires, and we're going to hire new people to vet and to do this stuff so that we have good information and that we don't regret this 2 years from now.
Well, again, if you want to know more about Kelly Shackelford, click on his picture there at pointofview.net or go to firstliberty.org. I think they deserve your support. I'm going to support them, and I hope you'll consider supporting Point of View, because you heard it right here on Point of View. Let's take a break. We'll take some more phone calls right after this.
Power of Three, in association with Smith Global Media, presents Believe. Christmas is a time to be thankful. But when tough times hit the small town of Grundy, Virginia, everything seems lost. This December,
all things are possible to those who believe.
One boy's decision to believe could change everything. Believe. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested. Now play. More information is available at www.believe.film.
There is a spiritual battle underway for our minds and the minds of our neighbors. Romans 12:2 tells us not to be conformed to the culture, but to be transformed by the renewal of our minds. What can you do? Get a free copy of Kerby Anderson's new ebook, Spiritual Warfare, The Battle to Restore Christ in Our Culture. It is a spiritual battle, and it must be fought with spiritual weapons. Get your copy at pointofview.net. Look for Spiritual Warfare, The Battle to Restore Christ in Our Culture by Kerby Anderson. It's free, but only when you visit pointofview.net. pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. It is our weekend edition. Penna, Dexter, Kelly, Shackelford. We've been talking about the cabinet. Before that, Chip and Joanna Gaines, and even the election recount and environmental reset. Lots of issues. Let's take one more call and we'll get back to some of these other cabinet officers that will actually most likely be confirmed and give you a better understanding of who they are. Well, let's go to North Carolina first. WLGP and Helen, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. I heard on the 12 o'clock news today on my local station that our junior senator, Tom Tillis, had said something that if something doesn't change in the Senate so that they can get something done, he's done.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised.
He's pretty newly elected.
Yeah. But again, I know some of those that came to Washington to make a difference. Louis Gohmert's been here. He said sometimes, he says, if I ever feel like I can't make a difference in Congress, I'll just do something else. And so this gets back to, in this case, let's talk about Tom Tillis for just a minute. In the Senate, the filibuster rule has prevented a lot of things from taking place. Is it reasonable to assume, Penna, that now that you don't have to come up with 60 votes to end a filibuster or a debate, that you might be able to push some pieces of legislation through that you couldn't before?
Absolutely. I think that it's good timing for the Republicans. The other thing is they've always had President Obama's veto hanging over their heads for a lot of legislation. And so now, this is such an opportunity for conservative values, for protecting religious liberty, for getting some good economic policies in, for shoring up our military, getting our foreign policy back on track. It's such a good opportunity. And, sometimes Republicans have a way of blowing good opportunities. And so I think in this case, and this is, I was at a conference recently and there were a lot of leaders from Christian conservative movement there. And I was encouraged to see how involved many of them are, how they are involved in the transition and all of that. People from Heritage Foundation are really involved. They've been making plans for Trump eventuality for over a year. So they've got all kinds of policies and suggestions for people that he should put in his cabinet, and some of them are being listened to. And I think with just the people out in the country, the grassroots, the listeners' point of view, it's such a time where we need to constantly be in contact with our senators, support them when they're doing the right things, tell them when they're, give them information you have, let them know what you think. Really, this is the opportunity for the believers now. It was an opportunity that a lot of people didn't expect to have. There's so much more influence for Christian conservatives in this administration, even than the Bush administration. Maybe back during the Reagan years, there was about this level. But I don't even know if that's the case. We have an opportunity now, and we need to take it. And I don't think that the we includes you and me, those of us listening. It's not just our elected representatives. We elect them. And at this point right now, they need and want to hear from us.
Kelly, what about that? Because what Penna says is it's a little different than even under the Obama administrations. Right now, if you had a president-elect Hillary Clinton, I think she'd already be naming all sorts of people without these interviews. But Donald Trump seems to be interviewing everybody, and that's rare whether you look at Obama, Clinton, Bush. You have to almost go back to Reagan to see something like this, where he's actually taking the time to interview so many of these individuals.
Well, that's what I think is so different, and why I said I thought this might be very different and even more conservative than Reagan. Which is, people think, well, how could you say that, right? Reagan did the same thing somewhat that that Bush did too, which is they brought their friends. Yeah. Okay? They brought, Ed Meese, who was a great guy, was brought in because they knew each other in California.
Oh, sure.
Right? But Bush, of course, this is the establishment, right? The establishment would come in, and they would bring all their establishment friends.
Yeah, and they didn't have to interview them. They already knew who they were going to bring in.
That's exactly right.
They already had the cabinet selected on election night.
So what we're watching here is very different.
Yes.
It really is CEO-like. It's a businessman who came in. He's addressing these problems individually, one at a time, and getting good information, and then making a decision. That's what an executive does.
And he does it very decisively and quickly.
Yeah, and so it's different from what we've seen, which I think most Americans appreciate. That, and there's something wrong with our system, to be honest. Yes. We elect people who are good politicians instead of people who are good executives.
Right.
Which
is why we've always wanted governors until fairly recently, or a CEO, and this is what you have in this case.
And so that's why it's fascinating to watch this. But what's interesting is it's resulting in much more conservative. It's because it's not just the small universe of who my friends are. It's I'm actually going to go and interview and trying to figure out who's going to be the best person on the economy, who's going to be the best person on HUD? Who's going to be the, whatever it is. And so he's bringing in these different people and interviewing, very different from what normally we watch and see happen. But the result is, because we have, somebody on the more conservative side than the liberal side who was elected. I mean, some people say, he's not a conservative. Well, I don't know what he is or not, but he ran on the conservative side. So when he goes to line these people up, that's a constituency that brought him. He's ending up with very strong conservatives in a number of these positions.
I think when you do go down to who this person is, how effective are they going to be at their job, and you are, from the conservative sort of running the gamut to the very liberal, usually on the liberal side, it's more of an agenda to get out there, where on the conservative side, it's more practical. It's what works. That's kind of what conservatives are. And so, really, people that are liberal are often much more ideological. It's weird for me to say that, and people could say, well, you're a conservative, that's why you say that. But really, the successful people in business, not that they're all conservative, but the principles of conservatism, they succeed and they work. And so Trump, I understand he's not a big reader. He's not a philosopher or anything like that, but he's sort of a practical guy. Mm-hmm. And he looks at what works, and he looks at what people are going to do and what ideas do they have. And that's where he's making his decisions.
And he's a little bit more like a Reagan or a George W. Bush in that he puts the right people in place, has a limited agenda, and lets them go do their work. There was a time, remember when Jimmy Carter, they actually began in the latter part, again, this is for our older listeners, in the late 70s, saying the presidency is too big, because Jimmy Carter would get on Air Force One or get on the helicopter and go to Camp David, and he'd have all these notebooks, and he was just totally worn out because he would enmesh himself in all the details. Ronald Reagan came in and said, I think I'm going to have a nap this afternoon. There are just certain things that I have the right people in the right places, and they're going to go and implement this policy, and I trust those individuals. And I get the sense that that's kind of really how Donald Trump's going to run his presidency.
And if they don't, what's Donald Trump going to say?
Two words that we have heard so often. And that was one of the biggest failures for Ronald Reagan. As much as we love Ronald Reagan, he could never let anybody go. But that is certainly the case. Let's talk about another cabinet officer. You mentioned pro-life. What about Dr. Tom Price as the head of Health and Human Services? Individual that has sponsored legislation to repeal and replace Obamacare, an individual that is pro-life, sanctity of human life. Penna, that sounds like a good appointment to me. What about you?
Yeah, he has, they've voted many, many times to repeal Obamacare. He's crafted plans for a replacement. He's also head of the Budget Committee in the House, which I think fits very well in HHS, because HHS can tend to be an agency that would have a lot of programs and spend a lot of money. So if you have a budgetary person, that's good. I think the thing that, he's pro-life too. And the thing that makes me happy and warms my heart really is, you look at Obamacare, and yes, it needs to be repealed and replaced, but this might not be the first thing that happens. So we've got Obamacare, and we've got all through it, the Secretary of Health and Human Services has so much rule writing power. Mm-hmm. And I don't know exactly how it works, but I think he could come in and actually reverse some of the bad rules.
Yes, he could.
Which, number one bad rule, I think, is the HHS mandate. Mm-hmm. And, that's been, Hobby Lobby decision help for businesses on that. But we still have all the nonprofits fighting and trying to get the Supreme Court to give them a good ruling. So some of this would just become, as Kelly said earlier, moot if the HHS secretary or the attorney general would use their power to reverse a lot of what was never passed through Congress. It was just written as rules.
Wow, just think of all the religious liberty issues that wouldn't exist if you had the Justice Department now interpret Title IX correctly.
Well, what about
marriage? And the Department of Health and Human Services interpret some of those rules carefully. We wouldn't have as much work for you, Kelly, to do the next handful of years, right?
The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the Department of Labor, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. I mean, you go through agency after agency that all have these discrimination rules that are being used against Christians. Yeah. And all of this it could be changed through executive, action. You don't have to go through Congress. But for long term, they can go through Congress and deal with these as well, because we don't talk about this a lot, but I mean, I know technically this might be true, but the reality is, was it 1938 was the last time the Republicans had the House, the Senate, and the presidency? I mean, I think George Bush had it for a few hours or something until you had somebody flip parties.
Senator Jeffers changed his mind,
But this is unique. I mean, they have all the branches, so they can push things through if they want to now.
If they don't, then the voters will let them know 2 years from now. We'll be right back.
On November 7th, a United Nations Conference on Climate Change convened in Marrakesh, Morocco. It's been the plan for years that this meeting would take place just 3 days after the Paris Climate Treaty went into force, thus hastening its implementation. 97 countries, accounting for approximately 2/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions, have now ratified the treaty. The U.S. is not one of them. The treaty would require that the U.S. reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. During the campaign, Donald Trump said he'd pull the U.S. out of the Paris Accords and stop funding the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and its Green Climate Fund. Now he says he'll, quote, keep an open mind about it. He should stick with his original promise, because the Paris Treaty will do little, if anything, to rein in global warming, at great cost to the economy. Environmental policy expert Bjorn Lomborg calculates that these cuts, if implemented between 2016 and 2030, would reduce temperature rises by a minuscule 0.09 degrees Fahrenheit. Dr. Lomborg estimates the hit to U.S. gross domestic product at approximately $150 billion per year. Bloomberg calculates it at more like $500 billion a year. Mr. Trump also said he'd, and again I'm quoting him, cancel job-killing restrictions on the production of American energy. He's referring to the capabilities for fracking and the development of new drilling techniques that give us the ability to tap new reserves of oil and gas. The White House and the EPA have responded with crushing regulations on this technology, which could otherwise essentially render the U.S. energy independent. There's a positive sign. Mr. Trump's choice of Myron E. Bell to head up the part of his transition team dealing with the EPA. At the Competitive Enterprise Institute, Mr. E. Bell has been developing common sense policy that protects the environment, yet minimizes industry and economy-destroying environmental regulation. It's possible Myron E. Bell himself may be the one the president chooses to head up the EPA. This has climate activists beside themselves. Last week, they waited until darkness fell in Washington, D.C. and beamed huge images onto EPA headquarters, demanding that the Trump administration pick someone else. Students at Harvard and Georgetown have been demonstrating against his appointment. The Wall Street Journal's Kim Strassel pointed out in a column that the real battle will be over how to dismantle the repressive environmental regime the administration has constructed. She writes, quote, "This is where the president's broad-based rules have arguably done the most damage to the economy. It is also where the progressive left is most organized and most emotional. Some of our most expensive regulations can be undone fairly easily, since Congress never passed them. But for the needed reset on the environment, Congress and the new administration have work to do." For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and again, Kelly Shackelford, Penna Dexter, and we have posted a lot of articles, 2 of those today on the Gaines. And again, if you have not followed the conversation that we've had in the first hour, Chip and Joanna Gaines, I think there's a lot of backlash. And so then we have one on the filibuster, we have one on the recounting of the whole recount, really, of the election. But there's one that we haven't mentioned. I thought we'd mention it since we did talk about Dr. Tom Price, and that is a piece that has come out recently in, of all places, a bioethics magazine and journal, arguing that doctors should not have conscientious objection. And so these 2 bioethicists, I don't think it's going to go anywhere, really want to bar Christians and those individuals that hold to religious beliefs, because if nothing else, they will not do abortion. They will not necessarily aid people in the right to die, the so-called physician-assisted suicide. We have talked about this many times, Penna, and if there's anything we certainly hold as a high esteem, it's conscientious objection. Hacksaw Ridge, which the 2 of you have seen, is a good example of that, and I just am amazed that this particular journal article is even published. But nevertheless, it's a good illustration of why we need to be vigilant, right?
Well, I've always thought that things like assisted suicide and abortion basically turn medicine on its head. It's the exact opposite of what medicine is. And so, as with so many things that the left does, they're turning the practice of medicine on its head when they say that if you don't agree that you would practice assisted suicide or abortion or whatever the killing process is, that you're not eligible to be a doctor. I mean, it's absurd. And so, but these absurd leftist ideas, we've seen so many of them become part of our legal system. And I'm really glad that we don't have the left in charge in the next 4 years, but we have to watch out for each one of these. So in a sense, it was appropriate for us to post this article today so people can see what's still out there in the minds of the left.
Yeah, look, I've been saying for a few years, as you know, all we do is religious liberty at First Liberty Institute, that we're in a fight over whether we're going to retain religious liberty, period.
Right.
And people usually, if they're not as used to being in this world, they don't see it every day. They don't realize it. But usually you can say, just think about the states that have tried to pass laws, basic laws on religious freedom, and what happens right now. I mean, it's so radioactive, right? Whether it was Indiana or Arkansas or Mississippi or Georgia or you name it. It's all of a sudden controversial to have religious liberty, to have conscience protection like we're talking about here. That's been as American as anything. It goes back to the founding. We cited in a brief to the Supreme Court. I forget, it was a huge number of laws, federal laws even, that have been in place forever that say we really respect conscientious objection. You know, that, for instance, if you, in your workplace, if they're asking you to do something that violates your faith, all these requirements are put on the employer to do everything possible to try to avoid that situation if they can. That's a basic American tradition. Well, that was under assault, and we're going to see now, is this election result going to change any of that? Is it going to, because we were in a real danger and a real battle on whether we're going to lose religious freedom. I think there are now opportunities to flip a lot of that. Some things that can be done to pass laws, for conscientious objection and protection. The federal government could do those things. There could be executive orders and things passed and all those. Those are short-term things. But even now that you place somebody in the Supreme Court, you place the 100 federal judges in the courts of appeals and district court, we can actually start to set precedents in moving religious freedom back. So there are opportunities now to more establish and re-entrench religious freedom and get back to the founding principles. But those are just opportunities. I don't know. We're going to have to wait and see what really happens over the next few years. But I do think things like this are now, there's a hope to fight back, and there's a little more muscle, a little more wind at our back to win the religious freedom war.
You know, you've seen in various laws that have happened over the last decades, the codification of sin, abortion, the way the marriage laws have been changed. And now these suicide laws that are passing in state by state, the marijuana laws, all of this. And so, with those laws, there's always a promise of exemptions and conscience protections and things. And so since we've got evil being sort of enshrined in a sense because we've lost the Christian consensus in the country, then we have to be very careful to protect our freedoms to dissent against it. And I think, we've watched just this week the death of Fidel Castro, the country of Cuba that was just absolutely ruined by those leftist policies. And so, we ought to take, if nothing else, we ought to take a lesson from that as we watch what happens in our country and some of the trends and protect the ability to live according to your conscience.
Yeah, I was just, I was at a deal this morning where I spoke, and before I spoke, somebody got up and read something, and I looked at what it was later. It was from the National Review. It was a story of somebody who was in Cuba, in prison.
Incredible, yeah.
And they talked about how they would listen every morning, and they would hear each step of the carrying out of the execution of people that morning. And they said that every morning they would hear, before they would die, they would hear these people say, it was something like, my commitment is to Christ, not communism. And then they would be shot. And they heard that, and it said they were a person of faith, but not really strong. But what the witness of these people is what really changed their life.
Wow.
And how they became stronger in their faith, and now they're out. But it was a longer story, but it really was a powerful. A lot of times people don't connect these communist evil regimes with anti-Christianity, but that's exactly what they are.
They're
anti-freedom.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so it's sad to watch these young people and others. I mean, it wasn't just young people, it's other people that don't even get what Fidel Castro, I mean, you'd like to take them and go, do you understand what he did? Mm-hmm. Do you, and so stories like this, like that was in that National Review, I thought was excellent in pointing out the truth of what was happening and the contrast with true Christianity and courage and faithfulness.
He was so threatened by Christianity that Christmas for much of his reign was not even celebrated in Cuba.
I have always thought that it would be interesting, especially in light of all of this week, to read some quotes and say, were these used to explain who Donald Trump is or who Fidel Castro? Because you want to talk about things that are on their head. I mean, he was referred to this week as a leader, maybe a strong man. It was about the worst I ever heard about him. And you look at all the things they've said about Donald Trump, even before he's in office, and it's almost like we've inverted all the values. It's just amazing to me.
It is amazing.
Well, we have run out of time, and I'm sorry we've run out of callers to get to because we have some of you that will have to wait till Monday, and we will do that. Kelly, let's just real quickly mention that you're encouraging people to support you as well. We encourage people to support Point of View, but you're kind of behind the scenes helping the Trump administration, if not directly, certainly indirectly, to evaluate some of these individuals that will be in the courts and determine our future, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, we felt like when we saw the judges being, obviously they're going to place Scalia to the Supreme Court and these others, that we had to start, look, anybody could do this, but this is what we do. So we started going through all their opinions, analyzing, pulling out information so that people could know, who are these people? Where do they stand? We can't make a mistake on these type of things because it's so long lasting. So yeah, we're going to do we see the next 2 years as a window of opportunity to change religious freedom and establish and advance things. And we encourage people to get involved. If they want to, they can go to firstliberty.org, and I'd encourage them to do that, sign up, donate, and just be a part of the effort of what's going to happen the next 2 years.
Yeah, we have a link to firstliberty.org. There's kind of a blue-gray place where you can say get action alerts and updates, and from that point you can begin to get involved with them. And again, don't forget, all of this is at our website. And again, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew, Catherine, and Shamil for the help behind the scenes. Have a great weekend, and we will be back here on Monday. See you then.
Power of Three, in association with Smith Global Media, presents Believe. Christmas is a time to be thankful. But when tough times hit the small town of Grundy, Virginia, everything seems lost. This December,
all things are possible to those who believe.
One boy's decision to believe could change everything. Believe. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested. Now play. More information is available at www.believe.film.
There is a spiritual battle underway for our minds and the minds of our neighbors. Romans 12:2 tells us not to be conformed to the culture, but to be transformed by the renewal of our minds. What can you do? Get a free copy of Kerby Anderson's new ebook, Spiritual Warfare, The Battle to Restore Christ in Our Culture. It is a spiritual battle, and it must be fought with spiritual weapons. Get your copy at pointofview.net. Look for Spiritual Warfare, The Battle to Restore Christ in Our Culture by Kerby Anderson. It's free, but only when you visit pointofview.net. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.